everyone. Welcome to Zoom for Lunch. Today we have one of your favorite speakers, Tara Schroer. She's the Colby Community College librarian, and a lot of you come to hear her during National Library Week. Since we're not having National Library Week in April, we've transferred it to the end of August and the first week of September. So she'll share another book there, but this week, she's going to share A Time of Mercy by John Grisham. And we want you to just enjoy her and enjoy her enthusiasm for reading and hope that this gets you started for your springtime read. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Thanks for having me today. So yes, like Melanie said, the book I am going to talk about is a Grisham, A Time for Mercy. Being a librarian, I just love to read, but I have to say Grisham is one of my favorite authors. So before I get into the book, let me tell you a little bit about him. So he's authored 35 novels, one work of nonfiction, which is titled The Innocent Man, Murder and Injustice in a Small Town, a collection of stories, and then he's also written 7 novels for young readers, and this is a series of books called Theodore Boone, A Young Lawyer. So according to his bio on johngrisham.com, surprisingly enough, this may surprise you all, that he was a lawyer before he was a writer. He went to and graduated from Ole Miss with his law degree, and he practiced law in South Haven, Mississippi. His hobby while practicing law was actually writing. So one of the things I thought was really interesting, that his specialty was criminal defense and personal injury litigation, which should not be a surprise if any of you have read Grisham's books. He also, which was unbeknownst to me, was elected and ran and served in the Mississippi House of Representatives from 1983 to 1990. So his first novel was written in the late 80s, and it was called A Time to Kill. And actually, this novel was inspired by true testimony that he overheard while he was in the courthouse in Mississippi. It was the testimony of a 12-year-old rape victim. And the testimony that he heard caused him to wonder, what would have happened if the girl's father had murdered the child's assailants? So he wrote a story about it. Now, his first book, like most authors, was rejected several times before it was published. And honestly, the very first book when the first publication of the book, A Time to Kill, only 5,000 copies were published at that time. And that was in 1988. That didn't deter him though. Actually, he began almost immediately writing his second novel. And what he would do, he would get up at 5 in the morning and he would write for several hours of the day before he would go off to the courthouse or to his law office. But the second novel he wrote was this neat little novel about a young hotshot lawyer fresh out of law school who took a job with what he perceived to be the perfect firm, and then quickly found out that things were not as they seemed to be. Mr. Grisham sold the rights to that book to Paramount Pictures. And Paramount Pictures made the movie that we all know of as The Firm, which starred Tom Cruise. That made John Grisham's career. It made his career. Doubleday Publishing then bought the book rights, and I believe still continue to have publishing rights to Grisham's books, and his career as a novelist took off. So, he did, though I thought this was also something interesting on his bio, he took a hiatus in 1996 and he went back to the courtroom. He took a case for a family that he represented. It was the family of a railroad man, a brakeman, who was pinned between 2 rail cars and he was killed. So Mr. Grisham prepared the case, argued the client's case, took it to trial, and he won over $680,000 for the family. That was the biggest verdict of Grisham's career. So since his success as a lawyer, then what he has done, he still lives in the South. I believe he still lives in Mississippi, and he has a lot of charitable causes that he donates to. A couple of them are the Rebuild the Coast Fund, which raised over $8 million for the Gulf Coast after Hurricane Katrina. Additionally, I thought this was kind of neat. He's the local Little League commissioner, and he has 6 ball fields that he had built on his property. He hosts over 350 kids a year for Little League games. So that's a little bit about John Grisham. And now let's talk about his latest book, A Time for Mercy. So the opening pages of this story begin, and within a few paragraphs, one of the things that really grabbed me by the throat with this was I could think of countless cases I had heard in the news, honestly, a couple of people I have known, who are victims of domestic violence. And that's really what the crux of this story is about. One of the neat things I think about Grisham is that he almost gives us two climaxes within his stories. But the main protagonists within this story are Josie, Drew, and Kira Gamble. Josie is the mother of Drew and Kira. And in order to keep her kids from being homeless, living on the streets or living in a camper, she latches on to a man who is a local sheriff's deputy by the name of Stu Kofer. This man, who is a mean man when he's sober and an even meaner drunk. He abuses Josie and he abuses the kids when he drinks. And on this particular night where the story takes off, he comes home, he accuses Josie of being unfaithful. He beats her, he knocks her to the floor, he chokes her, and ultimately knocks her out. He punches her into the jaw, which knocks her out and leaves her on the floor. Now, the kids, Drew and Kira, are upstairs, and they are hearing everything that is going on downstairs. Once the silence settles and they don't hear any more noise, the kids really begin to worry. Let me find my page. Drew walked through the small den and began to climb up the stairs, making as much noise as possible to frighten them. Halfway up, he called out in a high-pitched, drunken, almost playful voice, "Kira, oh Kira." In the darkness, she shuddered in fear and squeezed Drew's arm even tighter. Stu lumbered on, his steps landing heavy on the wooden stairs. "Kira, oh Kira." He opened Drew's unlocked door first, then slammed it. He turned the knob to Kira's and it was locked. "Ha ha, Kira, I know you're in there. Open the door." He fell against it with his shoulder. They were sitting together at the end of her narrow bed, staring at the door. Jammed against it was a rusted metal shaft Drew found in the barn, and with it he had rigged a doorstop that they prayed would hold. On one end was wedged against the door and the other against the metal bed frame. When Stu began rattling the lock, Drew and Kira, as rehearsed, leaned on the metal shaft to increase the pressure. They had practiced this scenario and were almost certain the door would hold. They had also planned an attack if the door came flying open. Kira would grab an old tennis racket and Drew would yank a small tube of pepper spray out of his pocket and blast away. Josie had bought it for the kids just in case. Stu might beat them again, but at least they would go down fighting. So they wait after that happens, and then they do finally go downstairs and find their mom on the floor, and they believe at the very first that she's dead. It's just a horrible scene I can only imagine. They call the police, and that's important. They call 911. Kira's laying on the floor, and she is holding her mother's head in her lap, begging her to wake up. And Drew is watching his sister with his mother, who they think is dead, and he has some very fearful thoughts. Other times when this has happened, and you know right away at the beginning of this, that this is not the first time that abuse like this or a scene like this is played out for these kids. But they're worried because other times Stu has done this. He goes upstairs, he passes out, he wakes up, he comes back down, and it's round two. And that is what Drew is really afraid of. And he hears noises, and he thinks that Stu is waking up to come back downstairs. So he goes upstairs to the bedroom to check, and he finds Stu's service revolver on the nightstand. So I want you to close your eyes and just imagine this. You know, you're Drew, and he's this scrawny 16-year-old kid. He doesn't even look 16. And he knows down to the very marrow of his bones that once the police arrive, that they're going to do nothing to protect him, to protect himself, to protect his mom, but most especially to protect Kira. So what do you do in Drew's shoes? Well, this is what Drew does. Drew and Kira could not take it anymore. The moment had come. Their only chance to survive was at hand, and Drew had to act. He returned to the bedroom and stared at Stu, still on his back and dead to the world. But oddly, one boot was off and on the floor. Dead was what he deserved. Drew slowly closed the door as if to protect Kira from any involvement. How easy would it be? Drew clasped the pistol with both hands. He held his breath and lowered the gun until the tip of the barrel was an inch from Stu's left temple. He closed his eyes and pulled the trigger. So he goes back downstairs after that, and they wait for the police to arrive on the scene. Drew never denies that he shot Stu Kofer, but the sheriff's deputies and the sheriff arrive. They arrest Drew. They figure out then at that point in time that Josie isn't dead, that she's just very severely hurt. They take Josie to the hospital. They arrest Drew, and Kira is placed with a family, with the pastor of their family from the church. So the next morning, then we have to enter the lawyer, Jake Briggins. He is the lawyer in Ford County, Mississippi, and this is not the first time that John Grisham has written a story with Jake Briggins as the lawyer. Anyone who read The Reckoning will soon recognize some of the characters in this story, including Harry Rex, who is the black sheep lawyer of Ford County, Sheriff Ozzie Walls, Jake's family, and then some other minor characters that are also within the town that pop up as the story goes along. So it is actually Harry Rex who tips Jake off and says, hey, you need to know what's coming down the pike here, buddy. If I was you, I'd get out of town as fast as I can. And the reason that he tips him off about that is because Jake Briggins is the only lawyer in the area who has defended a capital murder charge and was successful. And by successful, he got a not guilty by reason of insanity plea in The Reckoning. So unfortunately for Jake, I guess, he doesn't get out of town in time. In fact, Jake and his family are getting ready for church on a Sunday morning, and his phone rings. Well, he answers it. And it's none other than Judge News who is wanting to talk to him. Now, one of the things that really fascinated me with this story that I just kept thinking about over and over again, I thought this more than once in this story, was wondering if Grisham's former coworkers or anyone who worked in law with him ever read any of his and went, yep, that's exactly how it happens. This is what happens. Because some of that was really accurate and some of it's also pretty amusing as you go along through the story. So Judge News calls Jake that morning. They're getting ready to go to church. He's a Baptist judge and he practices Catholic guilt. And I feel like I can say that being Catholic myself because he laid it on really thick. He browbeats and guilts Jake into taking this case. And he just tells him, look, it's a 16-year-old kid. He's got to have a lawyer defend him when he goes in for arraignment. He's got to have someone. And then he promises Jake Briggins, if it goes to trial, I'll find a new attorney to take the case. And this was because Jake was so adamant about not taking it because of the backlash from the last capital murder case he tried where he feared for his family and he feared for his own safety. So the judge agrees to this promise, but we all really know at this point in time really what's going to happen. It was a pie crust promise. It was easily made and easily broken. So there's a lot of undertones in this story. All of these parts that just kind of look like they're off into little bitty places, but pretty soon as the story goes, they all start to push themselves together to move the story along. Like I said, Jake really struggled at the beginning, even with taking this trial or taking the case. No one wanted this case due to the fact that Stu Kofer was a cop, and cops stick together in small towns. So the thing that becomes immediately apparent, Drew never denies that he wasn't the one that pulled the trigger. He admits that he shot him. The case is not a case of guilty or not guilty, but life imprisonment or execution is what they're looking at here. So almost immediately after Jake takes this case, he starts getting threatening phone calls, threats to his family, which doesn't go over well. He starts to interview people and interview Drew, but as he interviews people about exactly what happened, the autopsy report comes out. And that's going to be very important in this story because Stu Kofer's blood alcohol content was 0.36, which is way over the legal limit for alcohol. As the interviews go on, some things come to light that are very, very important to the story. One of the main things being that 911 call that night was not the first call that had been made to the Kofer residence, but it was the only one that they had paperwork on. And as Jake starts to interview people, and talk to Sheriff Ozzie Walls, it becomes apparent that there are some things about his deputy that he didn't know, and there are some things happening in his department that were swept under the rug because the cops all stick together. So he begins and he interviews Drew. And immediately upon interviewing Drew, it becomes apparent that Drew needs help and that Drew is suffering from some form of PTSD, but PTSD from what no one really knows. So Jake asked to have Drew evaluated by a psychiatrist because Drew realizes he's done something wrong, but when he's pushed about it, he just retreats into himself. And so Jake fears that Drew won't be able to stand up to trial. He convinces the prosecutor, Lowell Dyer, and Judge News to allow him to be psychoanalyzed. And this is a little bit of what the psychologist found. I observed a teenage boy who is frightfully small for his age and can easily pass for a child several years younger. I did not, nor was I expected to, examine him physically, but I saw no signs of stage 3 or stage 4 pubescent developments. I observed the following, all of which are highly unusual for a 16-year-old. Little growth and no muscular development, no sign of facial hair, no sign of acne, a childlike voice with no deepening. He was unable to grasp even the simplest concepts, such as being placed in jail and not being able to leave whenever he wants. Drew says at times he remembers events, at times he forgets those same happenings. He asked me at least 3 times if Stuart Coker was really dead, but I did not answer him. I learned that Drew and his sister have been neglected, physically abused, psychologically abused, and subjected to domestic violence. I cannot say and do not know all of the people responsible for this. He was simply not that forthcoming. I strongly suspect there has been a lot of abuse, and Drew, and more than likely his sister too, suffered at the hands of several people. The sudden and or violent loss of a loved one can trigger traumatic stress in children. Drew and his sister had been abused by Mr. Coker. They thought, with good reason, that he had killed their mother and that he was about to harm them again. This is more than sufficient to trigger traumatic stress. So this was the first start of Jake Brigance building a case for the whys and why Drew should not be executed. That was the first step. So as the story goes along, Josie, she does get better. She was in the hospital for quite a long time, but she does get better. And then Kira had been placed with a local minister and the local minister's family. And so they begin to meet with Jake regarding the testimony they're going to give for Drew. Because remember, at the start and at the point of this story that we're at, what Jake is hoping for is to have a life imprisonment, not execution for Drew, who is only 16. So here's the bombshell, though. The pastor comes in and he visits with Jake. And at that point in time, it is revealed that Kira is about 3 months pregnant with none other than Stu Coker's baby. This is a humongous bombshell in this story. And Kira tells a very tearful and honestly, it was, as a mother, heart-wrenching story about being raped by Stu Coker, and that Stu told her he would kill Drew and that he would kill her mother if she told. As this kind of opens up the dam and tales of abuse just come forward by all 3 of them as Jake begins to investigate and do interviews with this. But the same thing the other thing that happens here is immediately after it's found that Kira is pregnant, there's a fight. Josie is a single mom. Josie had her kids really young, and Josie knows exactly how hard it is to be a single mom, young, and raise your kids. So she wants Kira to get an abortion. And Jake is fighting just as hard for that not to happen because he knows one of the only chances he has to keep Drew alive in prison is to have Kira be pregnant when the trial starts. And they can fight back and forth through this all throughout this story. So as the book grows along, the prosecution wants to interview both Kira and Josie. Now, Jake is hoping as we go through, there are 3 outcomes they talk about that can happen. The first is being guilty of capital murder. The second is being not guilty by reason of insanity. And then the third one is to have a hung jury. Those are the only three possible outcomes that could happen with this trial. And as the book goes, like I said, the prosecution wants to meet with Josie and wants to meet with Kira. And so Jake, he knows how to fight dirty, and he takes almost a don't ask, don't tell philosophy to what he is telling Kira and Josie, because he is coaching them up on how to answer questions from Lowell Dyer, the prosecutor. He even went so far as to instruct Kira at one point in the book what to wear, which was jeans and a shirt that was kind of snug or form-fitting, because at the time she was being interviewed by the prosecution, you didn't know she was pregnant because she wasn't showing yet. All of that comes to be meaningful as the story goes along. As the time for the trial gets closer and closer, Jake finds expert witnesses to refute the prosecution. And the process in this book just made me wonder if this is really how it happens in an actual trial. So he hires a co-counsel, her name was Libby, and they have this conversation about, well, we've got this guy who's a really good expert to refute what the prosecution's expert witness is going to say, but they are a different, they're of an Indian descent. They have a slight accent. We have a guy from New York who is really, really great, but he's got that New York accent, and people from the South are turned off by that. And then they're like, well, we got this guy here from Baylor University. He's just far enough away that the jury will be respectful of the fact that he must, because he's from far away, he must be really good. But he's got their drawl. He talks the Southern drawl. So that's the one that they went with. That was just fascinating to me. Made me wonder if that's really what happened. So we're getting pretty close to the trial, and while not hiding Kira from the prosecution, Jake sets things in motion to hide her from the townspeople. Because remember, this is small town Mississippi in this book. People talk, just kind of like we do in small town Northwest Kansas. So he secludes her until it's time for the trial to keep the pregnancy under wraps. And he's having closed-door conversations with experts. He talks with a judge who is friends with Judge News to convince that judge to tell Judge News to grant a change of venue to a different county, because he doesn't think Drew will get a fair trial in Ford County. He also convinces Josie to take Kira, move out of the area until the trial, and all of these pieces are going to come together at the start of the trial. And so then we get about a month before the trial date, and tension is really high in the community. Stu Kofer's family is vocally outraged at the fact that Jake is defending this young kid. Many of the townspeople treat Jake and his family like outcasts. This ripples into their personal life. It forces them to change churches. The churches they went to, the church they went to, they don't go to anymore. They started attending the church where Kira and her family went to. And then a month or so before the trial, tensions and anger really come to a head. Jake worked late on Monday and left the office after dark. Preoccupied, he was almost home when he remembered Carla wanted milk, eggs, 2 cans of tomato sauce, and coffee from the grocery store. He turned around and went to a Kroger east of town. He parked his red Saab in the lot that was almost empty, went in, filled his basket, checked out, stacked his own items, and was almost to the car when things took a sudden turn for the worse. An unfriendly voice behind him said, "Hey, Briggs." Jake turned and for a split second saw a face that was vaguely familiar. Holding the grocery bag, he couldn't duck in time to miss the sucker punch. It landed flush on his nose, cracked it, and knocked him to the asphalt beside his car. For a second, he could see nothing. A heavy boot landed in his right ear as he scrambled around. He felt a can of tomato sauce and quickly hurled it at the man, hitting him in the face. The man yelled, "You son of a bitch," and kicked him again. Jake was almost to his feet when a second man tackled him from behind. He landed hard on the asphalt again and managed to grab the hair of his tackler. The same heavy boot landed again on his forehead, and Jake was too stunned to fight back. He released his grip on the hair and tried to get up, but he was pinned on his back. The second assailant, a thick, heavy guy, pounded away at his face, cursing and growling, while the first one kicked his ribs and gut and anywhere else he could land a boot. When he kicked him in the testicles, Jake screamed and blacked out. 2 loud gunshots cracked through the air, and someone yelled, "Stop it!" The two thugs were startled and bolted from the scene. They were last seen sprinting around the corner of the store. Mr. William Bradley ran over with his pistol and said, "Oh my God." Jake was unconscious and his face was a bloody mess. So he ends up spending about 8 days in the hospital trying to get recuperated from the beating that he took in the parking lot. And at this point in time, everybody pretty much knows who did it. It's one of those things. Everyone knows it was family members of Stuart Cofer, but no one can prove it because no one saw their faces. So he recuperates, he gets better, then the trial is set to begin. It's a showdown in Van Buren County, at the Van Buren County Courthouse, so he got the change of venue and it's scheduled for August 6th. In the short weeks before the trial, there were many meetings that were held between Judge Noose, Lowell Dyer, and Jake Briggins. And this was just fascinating to me, just how the wheels of justice turned in this book behind the scenes. They had conversations including what could or would be introduced as evidence, how or what would be said in rebuttal, including the defense's claim that there was physical abuse and rape of Kira, which Dyer tried really hard to get taken out because in his words, the dead man was not on trial, nor was he going to be there to defend himself. And this is where Jake also kind of played dirty. He just kind of sat back and just said, well, we'll just see what happens. All of this was entered into evidence, though, and the next thing that happened was the polling of the jury. And I would love to speak to someone in law to find out if this is really what happens. The polling of the jury in this book was mind-blowing. Does it happen? They gave out 97 potential jurors, and they divided out these jurors among Jake, Harry Rex, Portia, their law clerk, and then a law buddy that Jake got to help her with this. And they do research on each potential juror. They looked up relatives, land transactions, marriages, divorces, almost down to the size of their underwear. And they take this information and they use it to try to keep the jurors out, to try and keep the jurors out they don't want, but keep the jurors they do want during selection before the trial. And so this is where the climax of the story, or the second climax of the story, really starts to happen. And it begins with jury selection. And the polling of the jury and digging around starts to pay off at this time because they find a juror who was once a victim of domestic violence herself. She left her first husband, but not without scars. Her ex-husband beat her when she served him with divorce papers. He was charged with violence, stalking, harassment at work. It ended with the divorce being granted, and the juror, whose name was Della Banker, left, made her way to Van Buren County, and now 15 years later, she's a juror on this case, and this is one juror that Jake really wanted to keep really, really bad. They kind of go through, there are some other ones they want to get rid of and some others that they want to keep, but once the jurors are set, and the ones that Jake wanted, including Della, made the cut, the trial begins. And the prosecution goes first, lays out their evidence, lays out their witnesses. Jake begins to lay groundwork when he cross-examines the state's witnesses about Stu Cofer's blood alcohol content, the lack of reports for the other 911 calls from the sheriff's deputies are brought to light. And then the trial continues on with the defense. And when Jake gets his turn, Josie testifies. The pictures of her in the hospital are shown, which tubes running out of her mouth, a broken jaw, her eyes are swollen shut. I mean, the fact that there was abuse is evident for everyone in that courtroom to see. At that point, the jurors, they talk in the book, the jurors are shocked, they're in disbelief. And as things go on and Josie tells her story, it becomes really evident that Jake is a good lawyer and knows what he's doing because he prepped her really, really well. And then Kira takes the stand. Kira entered the courtroom with a bailiff trailing behind. She walked slowly, looking down to avoid the stairs. She wore a simple, drip-dry cotton dress that was tight around the middle. By the time she stopped and faced the court reporter, everyone in the courtroom was staring at her belly. There were whispers in the gallery, and several of the jurors glanced around as if embarrassed for this poor child. She backed into the witness chair and sat gingerly, obviously uncomfortable. She glanced at the jurors as if ashamed, a terrified kid facing an adult screwed-up world. Jake said, You are Kira Gamble, sister of the accused, correct? Yes, sir. How old are you, Kira? 14. You are obviously pregnant. Yes, sir. Jake had played this scene 1,000 times, had lost hours of sleep over it, and had argued and debated and dissected it with his wife and his team. He couldn't blow it. Calmly, he said, "When is your baby due, Kira?" "Late next month." "And Kira, who is the father of your child?" As coach, she leaned a bit closer to the mic and said, "Stuart Cover." Now, as soon as those words are uttered, all proverbial hell broke loose in that courtroom. The Cofers who were there listening to the trial stood up. They started screaming and yelling. Mrs. Cofer, Stuart's mother, started bawling. The father and the brothers, who the two were suspected of putting the beating on Jake Briggins, had to be physically escorted out of the courtroom. Judge News calls for a recess. He takes Jake and Lowell into chambers. Jake is accused of hiding things from the prosecution, to which Jake says, "You interviewed her, what am I hiding?" pretty much. Lowell tries to get a continuance on the trial, to which Jake's like, "Absolutely, let's do that. Then the baby will be here. We can have the baby tested for DNA, and then we'll know without a doubt who it is." Lowell at this time kind of starts to feel his case start to have a whole lot of holes in it. And he doesn't really know what to do or how to stop what is happening. So after Kira is on the stand describing their life, and she describes in detail the assault by Stu Cofer on her, Drubin gets on and takes the stand in his defense as well. And he shoots some holes to the prosecution as well, and you can feel the doubt start to creep in, and that's what Jake is looking for. He is looking for not the fact, it's never disputed that Jake did not shoot Stuart Cofer, but it's why. It's why he shot him. And if you were a juror and this was you, what would you do to stop the abuse? Does the act justify the previous crime? And that's really what it's all about. So after Drew takes the stand, the defense rests, closing arguments are given, and then deliberation begins. And at this point in time, it is revealed in the book, they take us into the jury room, and one juror is called into Judge Noose's chambers, gives an accounting of what's going on. Bailiffs had to break up 2 fights within hours of the deliberations. Judge Noose called the jurors all back in, and it was at that point in time, they couldn't come to a consensus. So he asks them at one point, whatever side you're on, whether you think he's guilty or you think it's not, flip your sides. Defend the other side and see if you can get somewhere to where they can all come to a consensus. Hours and hours of deliberation. And at the end of this, the jury comes back and they're deadlocked 6-6, and a mistrial is declared. So now you may be thinking, is the mistrial the end? Well, in the midst of this story in true Grisham style, there's a whole lot of subplots. The financial struggles of Jake's law office. There was a railroad lawsuit, which started to look really promising at the beginning, but kind of nagged its way like a thorn in his side throughout the entire story. How does Jake get paid for Drew's trial? Because if you remember, he didn't want it, but he was essentially forced to take it for almost no money. So what happens to all of those questions? And then the most important question that everyone's going to want to know, what happened to Kira's baby? Well, if you want to know the answers to those stories, you're going to have to read the book. Thank you very much for your time today.